Good morning on this Sunday, June 7th, and welcome to the Georgia Gang. Racial tensions hit a tipping point in Atlanta and across the United States as some protests turned violent. New developments in the shooting death of Ahmaud Arbery. Investigators say Arbery's killer called him the N-word after he shot him. And the political races to watch as voters head to the polls for the long-awaited Georgia primary. We're still keeping our distance, but Theron, Phil, Janelle, and Kathy are all here. The debate and discussion begin right now.
From the Fox 5 studios, the Georgia Gang starts now.
It was a week full of protests. Some of them turned violent here in Atlanta as curfews remain in effect for the city of Atlanta. On Thursday, the seventh day of protests, Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms and Police Chief Erica Shields took to the streets to talk to protesters.
And what I'm saying to you all today, there is something better on the other side of this. There's something better on the other side of this for us, and there's something better on the other side of this for our children's children.
City officials said this was an impromptu walk with protesters to show solidarity against racism and injustice. Last week, when these protests turned violent, Bottoms made an emotional plea for the looting to stop and received praise all over the country for her passionate speech.
You're not honoring the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement. You're not protesting anything running out with brown liquor in your hands, breaking windows in this city.
Mayor Bottoms has announced an executive order to establish a commission that will renew the police department's use of force policy. And I want to turn to the panel now. And, I've been thinking a lot of how we wanted to start the show. We all got together, just to let the viewers know, we all got together on Zoom this week before the taping just to see where we all are. And just like many of you, we're having conversations and real conversations about race. And as our viewers know that we're all friends on the show and friends have empathy for one another, and we try to understand where one another is coming from. So with that said, I'd like to start off with Janelle and just your thoughts about the week. We ran out of time last week to get you and Kathy on these issues, so we'll start with you, Janelle.
Okay, thank you, Lori. Yeah, I definitely feel like this is definitely an emotional time for a lot of people. My concern is that I really don't want us to lose sight of what the protests are about, the peaceful protesting is about. It's important that as peaceful protesters that we also play a role in making sure that we control what's happening on the streets. When you're on the front lines and you see that the looting and the rioting is beginning, I think it's important to step up and say something to make sure that we are addressing that, and so that the memory in this moment and this opportunity that we have in front of us is not being lost. Former U.S. Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice said it best earlier this week in an op-ed, where she stated that any call to action will be empty if it does not move us into individual responsibility. And I think that's a loaded statement that encourages all to play a role no matter where we are in this.
Kathy, I do feel like there is a shift, at least at the time of this taping, from kind of the looting and all of the violence to back to the protest and the core issues at heart. What are your thoughts?
Well, I agree that there have been, and I think that there have been incredible discoveries along the way, that some of that was instigated by white supremacists from people from the outside that were coming in to kind of throw gasoline on the fire, and now we've returned to what we do best here in Atlanta, which is to have protests with meaning. For me, it's been a tremendously emotional, more than a week. We've watched the murders of two black men play out. We've watched people use white privilege to threaten false reports to police on people. And I think it has illustrated for anyone who doesn't think that structural racism exists in this country and that criminal justice reform, among other things, need to happen. And on top of that, we have a pandemic that's hurting the people who struggle the most. And so that's really exposing the fault lines of economic racism and insecurity. And so we have a lot of work to do, and we will see this discussion continue to play out, but most immediately in how we conduct our election on Tuesday, and as the General Assembly begins its work in defining priorities, which we've had some discussion about in recent weeks.
And we'll talk about those a little bit later in the show. Theron, You give us a perspective on this panel, you know, that no one can. We've prided ourselves in the fact that Atlanta has always shown the rest of the country how to protest on issues of race. Churches we see work with police departments. The community steps up, the business community steps up really in a time of need. Our political leaders lead, and I think that was evident with Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms. So my question to you is, how do we turn all of these conversations into action, especially, you know, we in the white community who want to turn these conversations into action?
Yeah, thank you, Lori. I think the first thing we've got to do, and I agree completely with Janelle, is let's not lose sight of why these peaceful protests began, and let's not lose sight of what they're actually protesting for. But I think the next step is that we've got to create a forum for a lot of these protesters and these organizations who have been on the front lines for decades, to give them an opportunity to be heard. And like President Barack Obama said this week, is that we hear you loud and clear. And then lastly, Lori, I can't tell you how many of my white and Asian and Hispanic, but particularly white friends, have reached out to me this week with so much encouragement, so many words of inspiration. And so, you know, this is not just a African American or young people's movement. This is a biracial, bipartisan movement that's going on in our city. And I thank Mayor Bottoms for her leadership on this issue. Good
points. Phil, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think Friday, May 29th was a sad day for the city of Atlanta. Of course, yes, everyone has the right to peacefully demonstrate, and of course the terrible killing of George Floyd was just obviously upset not just Georgia but the country. However, it turned into a bad night for the city of Atlanta and Georgia and the country, especially in Atlanta with the looting. The police were totally unprepared. It was shocking. It was unacceptable for Chief Erica Shields to even admit that they were unprepared for the damage, hundreds of thousands of dollars of damages in business. The police were overwhelmed in many areas, but I'm glad Mayor Bottoms pivoted. She did have a very good speech. She did finally request the National Guard to come in. If you want to call it good news, that was the good news when Governor Kemp acted with her and brought in the forces to restore law and order. So, and I got a lot of response from a lot of people, and I would agree with there. And there's a biracial concern of peaceful demonstrations being hijacked by radicals, especially as we're finding out the far left Antifa was involved, and also anarchists, and these were criminals. They weren't going to go home. I think Mayor Bottoms gave a great plea to go home, but those folks weren't going to go home.
Let's talk about that, Janelle, because civil rights leader, Congressman, icon John Lewis came out to say that rioting, looting, and burning are not the way. We also heard a similar sentiment from Ambassador Andrew Young. Unfortunately, the violence is what got the attention of the country.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing I will say about Congressman Lewis, so we certainly appreciate his contributions and what he's done to move this state forward and move this country forward as it relates to race relations. I know recently he endorsed former Vice President Joe Biden, and I found that to be a step, I guess, in the right direction. I mean, I know Joe Biden was in office for the past 45, 50 years, and he was actively fighting against a number of policies and things that Congressman Lewis was fighting for. And so if he can accept the apology of Biden, I think that does show that we have growth that's happening in this state. I also think that we have to look towards it and say, what can we do today to change tomorrow?
Kathy, as if the Ahmaud Arbery case couldn't get any worse, during preliminary hearings, investigators say that Travis McMichael called Arbery the N-word after he shot and killed him. The judge, of course, ruled that the case against all three men should move forward, a step in the right direction. But just kind of your thoughts on what's happening here in Georgia on that case.
Well, it's sickening, but it's not surprising. I mean, I feel like what we saw in that video is what we saw. We saw people in trucks chasing an innocent man down and forcing him to fight for his life, which he ultimately lost. That those men stayed unarrested for so long is just. It's just heartbreaking, and I'm glad they're in custody. I'm glad we're now seeking justice, but at the end of the day, Ahmaud Arbery is dead, and that didn't need to have happened. It shouldn't have happened. And so we've got work to do, not only on criminal justice reform, but again, on a whole package of things. But criminal justice reform and really looking at, citizen arrest laws, the erosion, when we change stand your ground to eliminate people's requirement to retreat if they can safely do so. The fact that people are running around with assault weapons in open carry and provoking people, those are just the tip of the iceberg of what needs to change. So we've got very, very hard work to do, and I hope we can join together and get it done fast.
Well, we're going to continue this discussion after the break because Atlanta's police chief accuses the Fulton County DA of political jockeying after charging 6 police officers accused of excessive force during the protests.
Have a question or comment for the Georgia Gang? Email them at georgiagang@foxtv.com.
Atlanta Police Chief Erica Shields did not mince words in a letter to her officers. She accused District Attorney Paul Howard of playing politics for filing criminal charges against 6 Atlanta police officers. They're accused of using excessive force against 2 college students during a night of protest. Theron, I want to turn to you. What do you think about all of this? I mean, were charges warranted?
Well, you got to give Chief Shields credit. I mean, we saw visuals of her actually in the crowd on that Friday when the peaceful protesting was going on. She did her best to implement, I believe, a strategy which was to make sure we had the proper amount of police present, but make sure that the peaceful protesters felt that they could protest because that's their right. What happened is that as things went on, there was 2 officers that were on a video that was, I think, as the mayor used the term, it was a little excessive. Not a little excessive, it was just excessive, and it was horrific to see these 2 college students sort of be arrested and apprehended the way they were apprehended. So they immediately moved to fire the 2 officers that they believe that were involved the most. But then, the district attorney comes back and then he says, he has a pending investigation going on. And so I'm not going to get into whether it was right or wrong and whether Chief Shields is right or he's right or both of them are wrong. But what I will tell you is that let's not forget, part of the reasons we saw the demonstrations early on in Minneapolis was because the district attorney was so slow to act in charging and arresting the officers that were involved. And so while you may take different sides on whether you agree with the chief or the DA, I will tell you that by moving forward in this process, I think that was one of the many things that the peaceful protesters were marching about.
Phil, what do you think about the fact that the District Attorney Paul Howard moved so quickly on these charges?
Well, even though I've been highly critical of Chief Shields for some of her permissive policies, I'm going to agree with her on that one. I think that it's an open secret in Atlanta that District Attorney Howard and the chief have had a rocky relationship for quite a while, and I think that there was no coordination by the DA with the chief and the mayor. I think everybody's in favor of getting rid of bad cops, but I also believe, and I think most people would believe, that there should be due process. And DA Howard is facing a tough re-election bid just on June 9th, and I think his opponent, Fonnie Willis, is gaining a lot of traction and trying to topple him. I think it was political. I think the chief was right. I think that the criminal charges weren't warranted. Maybe some punishment is warranted, but certainly not what the DA did.
Janelle, I want to switch gears and kind of talk state politics now. Pressure is mounting for the Georgia Senate to pass a hate crimes bill already passed by the House. This week, the Georgia Police Chiefs Association came out in favor of the bill. What do you think? Because isn't this a matter of, the bill isn't perfect, right? Both sides agree it's not perfect, but isn't this a matter of sending a message to the rest of the country that we're not going to be one of 4 states that don't have a hate crimes bill?
So I'm all for sending a message to the country. I have to say, though, that I've never really been a fan of anything or any bill that has mandatory sentencing associated to it. We saw from the third strike law that took place in 1994 that mandatory sentencing has impacted the black community disproportionately. 5 years after that bill had passed, Georgia came in second to California with the most people incarcerated due to that particular law. So in my opinion, opinion, if we have to police our judges and police our leadership in order to do the right thing, I think we're just knocking off fruit and not actually hitting the root. I think that we need to take a closer look at the citizens' arrest law. I know that's something that is on the table. I think that is something that we definitely should drive. But if we can't get this hate crime bill written exactly to where it protects everyone and doesn't create a mandatory sentencing situation that may end up hurting a particular group of people, then I don't think it should pass. But I definitely am for the citizens' arrest.
Kathy, let me ask you on that, because we heard from the Lieutenant Governor this week that he is all for passing a meaningful hate crimes bill. They don't have a lot of time in the session, but is it worth it to pass something that they can strengthen later?
You know, probably the short answer to that is yes. But let me just say, you know, this is much ado at a time when more needs to be done, right? We've been trying to get a hate crimes law passed in Georgia for over 20 years. This is not complicated. 46 other states have them. All we need to do is look and see what are in those bills, put it in ours, and pass the darn thing. Because we need that option. One thing I want to correct, Janelle, is I don't believe that our hate crimes bill as it's currently written has mandatory penalties. What it does is give judges the option to add charges of hate crimes and have additional penalties applied if the person is convicted of that particular crime. What this doesn't do, which I think is important, is mandate that all jurisdictions collect and report data to the FBI's Uniform Annual Crime Report, and to train law enforcement to recognize these crimes, because a lot of times things happen in communities that don't get addressed because people don't understand what they are.
Phil,
that said, this should not be the focus of the General Assembly session. We need to start working on criminal justice reform, and we need to have meaningful changes in this 11-day session.
Phil, we're running out of time. Your sources have told you that this bill will not pass, but considering the events of this past week, are you seeing more momentum now?
Not really.
Well,
I think things haven't changed. I think things haven't really changed since we discussed it last week. I think the Lieutenant Governor is right that we've got to do this correctly. I actually am going to agree with Kathy. I don't think this is a priority. You do need to amend the bill. I pointed out that folks both on the political left and the right don't like it. And you need to define basically what is going to be a hate crime, and it's going to be tough to try to prove it. So you've got to have more specificity if you're going to have a hate crime bill.
All right, thank you, Phil. Well, coming up, as lawmakers get set to return to the state capitol, there's an update on state revenues. Stay tuned, everyone.
Join the discussion on the Georgia Gang Facebook page and watch past episodes on the Georgia Gang YouTube channel.
An update now on state revenues during the COVID-19 pandemic. They're not pretty, but they're not as ugly as first projected. Instead of a 14% drop, Governor Kemp says it's looking more like an 11% drop. Theron, do you think there's any chance that states will get help from the federal government?
I sure hope so. I think that's one of the reasons why you've seen Governor Kemp maintain a good working relationship with President Trump and his entire Georgia delegation. And so that 3% sort of that we are hopefully going to be able to get back, or we're not as going to lose as much, is a big deal. And so, you know, this is something that is very important going into the session. I know that the governor, the lieutenant governor, and the speaker are meeting on this daily, and they're really entrusting a lot of smart people to figure out how do they not only preserve what we have, but how we can really come together and figure out different methods of revenue going forward. And so we need the federal help. This is where members of Congress and our 2 U.S. senators, with the relationship with the governor, I think is really going to be tested. And let's hope that we can get that assistance that we deserve.
A lot of work ahead. Phil, I want to switch gears. Is there really a chance that Georgia could host the GOP convention, since North Carolina may no longer be an option because of the restrictions in place there on COVID-19?
I think Georgia has a 50-50 shot in Atlanta with perhaps the World Congress Center or or maybe even a combination of the World Congress Center or the Mercedes-Benz Stadium. From my sources in D.C. and Georgia, I think that about 4 states are in consideration. Although I am hearing, and it's a disappointment, I know the Democrats are facing the same dilemma with their convention, but in late August.
Oh, Phil is frozen up there, but I want to ask each of you, because we can't forget that Georgia's long-awaited primary is Tuesday. So maybe we'll start with Janelle. Which races, each of you have maybe 30 seconds, which races are you keeping an eye on?
So right now, I'm keeping an eye on Congressional District 7. I want to see who's going to come out of that primary on the Republican side, whether it's Senator Unterman or Dr. McCormick. I think those are the two that's kind of leading right now. Excuse me. So I really am interested in watching Georgia 7.
Kathy.
Well, I'm kind of with Janelle. I'm watching the other side to see if Carolyn Bordeaux pulls it out a second time and is, ready to win this seat, as she came so close to do last time around. I'm also looking at the Democratic side of the Senate seat and the race between John Ossoff, Teresa Tomlinson, and Sarah Riggs Amico. And I think that's going to be a very interesting race. It'll end up in a runoff, and then we'll have more things we need to watch for.
I agree with that. Theron, we've got congressional races 6th, 7th, 9th, 14th that I'll be watching. What are your thoughts?
I agree with Kathy. I'm definitely paying close attention to the primary in the U.S. Senate race. But Lori, I'm also paying very close attention to the Fulton County Sheriff's race. We haven't talked a lot about this on the show, but you have a lot of candidates running against incumbent Ted Jackson, and so that's going to be a very close race to watch. A lot of people are looking to see if that race is going to go to a runoff, and so we got to wait and see. But I think that's an important one in Fulton County.
Phil, we have you back. What races will you be watching on Tuesday?
Well, I think there's a bunch of GOP primaries, especially state Senate races. You've got some interesting state House primaries. You've got to gear up for the November elections. If you're on the GOP side, especially with the state House, that could be very competitive. And of course, I think Karen Handel is in very good shape in that 6th district race. She's going to face Democrat Lucy McBath. So it'll be an interesting Tuesday night.
It sure will, and we'll just have to wait and see how long it will be to get all of the ballots counted, all those absentee ballots. Thanks, everyone. And coming up, we will have winners and losers. Stay tuned.
Time now for the week's winners and losers.
Phil, we will go right to you since we didn't get a chance to hear your winners and losers last week.
Well, thank you, Lori. I've got as one winner the late Colonel Oscar Poole of Ellijay. He passed away at age 90. He was well known as being the great barbecue baron, Poole's Barbecue, well known up in North Georgia. Secondly, another winner is Governor Kemp, as I alluded to earlier. He and Mayor Bottoms got to coordinate finally. The National Guard was called in. The governor, the mayor, and their whole team of law enforcement officials really tried to stop the horrific looting and rioting, and that was great. And again, Fulton County District Attorney Paul Howard, my loser, he should not have criminal charged those 6 officers, and it's terrible for morale for the police in Atlanta.
Theron, over to you.
My first winner is going to be the Family Health Centers of Georgia, MARTA, and Councilwoman Andrea Boone. Lori, they tested over 400 people last week in Atlanta at the H.E. Holmes MARTA station, so definitely going to make them a winner. And then my next winner is going to be the attorneys Justin Miller, Chris Stewart, and Molly Davis. These are hardworking attorneys who are on the front line fighting many of the cases that we talk about every single day and every single week on this show. And then lastly, I want to send my condolences to Federal Judge Steve Jones. Unfortunately, he lost his mom, and I definitely want to offer my condolences to Judge Steve Jones and his family.
All right, Janelle, over to you.
Yes, I have 2 winners. So my first winner is Mr. John Loud. He's chairman of the Cobb County Chamber of Commerce. He worked together with the county of Cobb to obtain $50 million to assist chamber businesses that were impacted by COVID-19. And my second set of winners is my grandma Maureen and Mr. Red. They allowed me to film in their home, and I thought that was so awesome. So they're my husband's grandparents, but now mine. So thank you to you both.
Wondering where you were today, Janelle. Thanks. And Kathy.
Hey, Tuesday is Election Day, so let's all be winners this week. And if you have returned your absentee ballot or voted, go to the My Voter page at the Georgia Secretary of State website and see if your ballot has been accepted. If you haven't received your ballot, then be prepared to vote and make a plan, because it's going to take a long time. If you have your absentee ballot and you haven't returned it, make sure to return it to one of the official drop boxes. Don't put it in the mail, because it probably won't make it. But at the end of the day, please make a plan, make sure your vote counts, and get out there and exercise your rights.
Great advice, Kathy. Thank you so much. And thank you to the panel for really just having some real conversations on this show. And I want to make Mayor Bottoms my winner. I thought she did an outstanding job this past week of handling the protesters, of sending a message to America, and really becoming America's mom is what she was deemed. I think it was by the New York Times. So thank you all so much for tuning in. Make it a great week, and we will see you back here next week.
The opinions expressed in this broadcast are those of the panelists appearing in this program.